coming. I know that the program was a little bit messed up online and in the booklet, so just to make sure everybody's in the right place, this is getting started with data science. So if you all are looking for something else or don't find this very interesting, feel free to vote with your feet. I won't take offense. There's probably a lot of other interesting things there. It looks like the projector's cutting off some of the side here, so I'll try to illustrate anything that might be missing, but feel free to jump in with any questions or any clarifying remarks or comments or anything like that as we get going. This will be some of me talking, but hopefully mostly conversations and questions and discussion as we go along here. So I'm not sure how many people here know about the Center for Government Excellence, so just a really quick overview about who we are and who I am. We are an organization within Johns Hopkins University that's funded from Bloomberg Philanthropies from the What Works Cities initiative. And we help mid-sized city governments through this initiative use and understand their data better to make decisions and really to inform their policy and achieve outcomes for residents. So my name is Matt Pizzolis. I'm the Chief Data Scientist at GovEx. I've been here for about 3 years, mostly working on performance management and open data management type projects. And then this past year, we're starting to launch a new data science practice, helping city governments take on more advanced analytical techniques and apply them to some of the problems that they're facing right now. So just to sort of start off, I did a little introduction of myself, but I'm really interested to see, who all is in the room. What are you looking to get out of today's session? What kind of experience are you coming to the table here? So just kind of a quick show of hands. How many of you are analysts, are working with data pretty regularly through the week? A handful, okay. How many are more sort of in management roles that might be making decisions about these sorts of projects? All right. And does anybody fall sort of into a third category? Oh, sure, yeah. So anybody that didn't, so what was your experience with data science, or how are you coming into this?
If it's handed to me, if I didn't at the time, I'll ask for whatever. It's not like a hands-on everyday thing.
Sure. Great. So what are you all looking why did you come to the session today? What are you looking to get out of this? Are there any specific issues or questions that you were coming to the table with, or anything that you saw the session and you wanted to come? Yeah.
So I work for the city of Madison, Wisconsin.
Sorry. Just for the record, we have some microphones.
So I work for the city of Madison, Wisconsin, and am the director of the Department of Planning, Community, and Economic Development. And we have some antiquated systems around data and how we use data. And I feel like we need to be much more aggressive in terms of how we collect, clean, and use data to make decisions for our community.
Absolutely. That's a great reason. Yeah, here. So anybody else have any sort of really pressing interests or anything that you want to make sure that we hit today? Yeah. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Beth Harbor here in Baltimore, and I'm just curious about smart cities and data that's being collected in other cities, and whether there's there to it, or what are best practices.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Anybody else have anything to add, or any viewpoints that may not have been heard? Anything else that people want to contribute? Yeah.
I'm interested in learning more about how to use data for prioritizing and making decisions.
Great.
So I work with a violence prevention organization, and we're developing metrics to recommend to cities that we partner with on what they should be collecting, what they should be examining, on what they might already be collecting, and what they should start collecting. So it's kind of trying to figure out what's feasible and how you can sort of tier out these metrics in terms of what might already be there and what the goal should be.
Any last comments or thoughts or anything? So I think that definitely is some really great entry points for talking about data science, and particularly getting into the nitty-gritty of how data science operates within city governments, and how we can effectively scope these projects so that they don't drag on and on, they don't start creeping to encompass lots of different things, But at the end, you also have a product that's usable, that's desirable, that was going to be making an impact in real, meaningful, tangible ways in your community as well, and not just sort of looking at technology improvements or little incremental things here and there. So today we're going to talk a little bit about data science and government. What is data science, and trying to establish some sort of a common understanding of that. Some anecdotes from what we've seen in cities, working with them in the field, and how they're actually using this in practice. Before getting into this method that we've developed about how we can more effectively scope data science projects, which I think is mainly about knowing where your blind spots are, being able to cover that, and engaging lots of people along the way. So we'll get into that in a little bit. You should all also have some packets in front of you. If you don't, there might be some extras floating around. But this is also sort of a distillation of this presentation. It has some worksheets in here that we'll use in a little bit as well, and also some templates for you to help structure your thinking about potential projects in the future to take home as well. So as we go through this, we'll start working through this worksheet, but feel free also to use this when you go back to your own organizations. Feel free to reach out if you have questions, things like that as well. So we'll have this to help us along. So just to start off with data science and government, I think data science is one of these buzzwords that's out there that a lot of people understand it to mean a lot of different things. It often gets conflated with different concepts, especially when people are talking about big data and these sorts of items as well. So just to kind of survey the room, what do you think that data science is, and how would you describe it to somebody? I put up here to your neighbor or to your boss, but basically just trying to talk about how would you describe this to somebody who isn't very analytical and might be intimidated by terminology like machine learning or something like that. Does anybody have a good way that they usually do an elevator pitch, or they talk to their families around Thanksgiving, around what are the kinds of projects that you're doing? Has anybody heard data science described as a buzzword, and maybe you think that it should be described as something else? I know that Nate Silver, for instance, thinks that statistician is a perfectly adequate term for data science. It doesn't see there to be a need. But I've heard all sorts of things from, isn't this just math with computers, or dataology, or any number of other sort of fields? So has anybody encountered that before, or had that experience of trying to clarify what data science is as compared to other forms of analysis? Sure.
It's kind of along these lines, but what I've been working on as a project, we have a pretty robust GIS team. And we don't have the resources to hire on a data science team, but I can retool a GIS team to cover data sciences. And really, one of the challenges I've had is that it seems like there's a little bit of dogma when it comes to data scientist versus GIS specialist versus other disciplines. And my interpretation of data science has been, communicating data in a way that it tells a story, that it has a narrative to it, or that it allows people to develop a narrative. And so I'm curious, from this, I'm hoping to kind of get some ammunition to come back to kind of convince people that, hey, we can rethink the way that we're managing this now. Because I think it's mostly a buzzword, but I think a lot of people just have these really tightly held definitions about what that buzzword means.
Yeah, you could have whole conferences on parsing out what these different terms mean and what kind of roles are there. But ultimately, I think that a lot of these different fields that are sort of related around data analysis and statistics are starting to really converge around these different concepts as new tools are being converted across these fields, and people are gaining similar skills and applying them to similar problems as well. So maybe the definition of it isn't as important as much as it is, like you said, being able to communicate what these concepts are clearly. What are you doing? How did you arrive at these answers? And how is this really going to impact the day-to-day life of a resident or of a worker within a staff member within city government or another organization? So this is actually a definition for innovation. So it's an equation that questions plus action equals innovation. And basically, you don't get anything unless you're asking the right questions. And then beyond just having the right questions, if you are thinking about these things, but you don't do anything that's philosophy. We don't really get much out of that in government for residents, things like that. But being able to apply action to the questions that you're asking is really where this new ground gets broken. And so what I would kind of posit is that data science is that plus sign. So you say, all right, so we have data, we have information, and we want to get to action, but there's a big gap in between here that really relies right now on a lot of personal experience and know-how, some expertise that's gained through studies and academia, but also probably a lot through work experience and other sorts of exposure like that. But how do you really know what is the best solution? How do you understand what the story is within the data that you're trying to tell? So this is where I would say that data science really tries to dive in and expand not just the what of what's going on and what's happening currently within the city, but how do you actually get from that to the action that you need to take in order to solve some issues. This is another way that you might have seen data science defined, is this overlap between a couple of different domains. So this is the Venn diagram of math and statistics meeting computer science and coding, and domain expertise all mixed in, and where all of those things overlap is where we can find data science. So to unpack this a little bit more, math and statistics, when we're talking about city analytics, generally, this is presenting at a stat meeting or in an annual report. What's been going on, looking at the data from an operational lens, but trying to tell the story of how well are we doing, what are the trends, and what can we really expect from this. So to try to apply this to more of a real-life city scenario, I like to look at New Orleans. And so some of you may be familiar with this project. But basically, there was an incident in New Orleans a couple of years ago where there was a house fire that killed the residents of the northern side. It was a family of 5, some children. And that kind of thing in today's world, it seems really unthinkable, especially when you talk about prevention, we talk about all the things that we're doing. But so when you go in and you look at the data, we could see that most houses have smoke detectors. So 90 to 95% of houses, depending on where you go to look at the data, have a smoke detector within them. Never mind that about half of those usually have dead batteries and then aren't working. But most of them actually have the detector that's inside their house. But for the ones that don't have any smoke detectors, this is really what's driving most of the deaths from these house fires. So, presented within the context of a stat meeting, we might say, okay, so, maybe we need to then roll out more smoke detectors. So this is really where the domain expertise part of data science comes in, where you're talking about being able to get to the question behind the question, where you're trying to dive down beyond just the superficial discussions that are happening and being able to evaluate the opportunities and possible solutions to this as well. So in this potential hypothetical stat conversation, we know that firefighters have a program where they go door to door in neighborhoods to hand out smoke detectors and install them for them. But this isn't particularly effective if you're trying to find that 5% of houses in your city that might be lacking a smoke detector. You don't have the resources to be able to do this. This might sound like a really great program on paper in order to tackle this problem, but if you were down there on the field, if you went on some of these door-to-door campaigns, you know that it's 1 in 20 houses might have that, but that's going to be variable depending on where you are. But sometimes you get some valuable observations and anecdotes out of that as well. So in this case, they were noticing that as they were knocking on doors, unless these folks were very elderly or very young, then typically they already had a smoke detector inside of it. So really this presents us with this problem where we have a situation within the city that we're hoping to resolve. We have a potential program that we can use to address it, but we don't have enough resources to really meet that need. And so this is where coding and computer science can really help by bringing in some of these more advanced methods for managing data, for sharing it to the right people and the analysts that are out there as well, and bringing in some more advanced applications of computer algorithms and machine learning, things like this. But one of the biggest powers here is being able to get integrated within the regular flow of business. So rather than just looking at a one-time report about where might the houses be, where we should target these firefighters' efforts, we want to encourage this to be incorporated into maybe their scheduling so that they know, of these houses in this block, which one should we go to first? If we're going to try to prioritize things, we want to make sure that we have a rolling schedule and a calendar that can come out that supports that as well. So New Orleans created this map that actually predicted a risk of a house missing a smoke alarm, and so that way they were able to better direct their firefighter resources to where that might be needed. So they were pulling in data that came from their fire department on previous fires and things like that, but also census information, demographics, as well as housing and building information about what actually was going on there. So within the American Housing Survey run by the census, there's actually questions in there like, do you have a smoke detector? How old is your house? What kind of building materials are in there? Things like that as well. So starting to look at all of these previous instances of fires, we can start to pick out this pattern of what is the kind of house or what is the kind of resident that might be missing a smoke detector. How do we find them and optimize our resources to get to those people? So when you put all of this together, they're able to create this new system and process that takes in data from a variety of sources, puts it all together in terms of figuring out what areas are the highest risk of missing a smoke detector, and then feeding that into the schedule for firefighters to go out door to door and try to meet this need. So does anybody have any questions so far just on data science in general, on the New Orleans firefighting example, anything like that so far? Oh, sorry.
How do you determine a confidence interval, or like if something's statistically significant, and like what you're really gonna use with it? Like how, you know what I mean? Like how compelling is it?
So I think that depends a lot on a couple of different factors. One of which is going to be like what kind of project are you taking on? Some things obviously matter a lot more than others. Where if you're talking about predicting recidivism rates, you're going to want to have a much tighter confidence interval than, say, if you're trying to schedule trash pickups or something like that. So it really depends on what your specific priorities are for a project. What is the cost of things like a false negative versus a false positive? So, for instance, is it worse to waste resources on somebody that may not need it, or is it worse to not give resources to somebody who may need it? And so based on that, you can start tweaking your model in different ways. So if it's important to be very accurate or very precise, you might make different trade-offs on that as well. So for instance, one project that we took on was actually with Kansas City, Missouri, where the ultimate goal that we were trying to do was to free up inspector time so that they weren't documenting cases as much as they were being able to work with individual homeowners to resolve violations. So to do that, we wanted to predict how long a violation would take to resolve after one inspection. So that way we could start prioritizing where do we go, where do we send resources and inspectors to either deal with really long-term cases or to close out things that we might think are already done. So to do that, we have this predictive model that comes up with a number of days value for a violation of being open. But that model, there's violations that are open anywhere from 10 days to 800 days. And this model will predict a value within about 45 days of the actual value most of the time. But we can tweak that if we wanted to get closer or we wanted to get more accurate. So say if we only cared about identifying the long-term cases, then that linear regression might not be as valuable as something classifying it. So we know that of that model, it's actually 97% accurate at predicting if a violation is going to take more than 300 days. So we actually have a very accurate model for predicting the extreme long cases, but for the short cases, it might not be as accurate. So you might cut it at different places depending on your use case and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about gaming out what that implementation looks like, but that's a great question. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Great. So now getting into actually scoping this effective data science project. First, before we get into talking about problems and we talk about data and everything like this, we want to do some housekeeping around the city to make sure that we have all of the foundations in place to have a successful project. So to start off with, talking about what kind of people we have on board and what kind of buy-in that we've already built around the city. This doesn't need to be, universal, and I think data science projects are a great way to generate, these wins and stories to go to other places and start talking about what you're able to do and help them with. But at the same time, without these sorts of people on board, your project's not going to go anywhere. So once you start talking about the decision makers that are there, do they have the understanding of what to expect from a data science project, how long it's going to take, and what kind of resources are involved? our managers bought into actually making a change and sticking to it and measuring that and trying to make it work. And our frontline staff and other people that are closest to the data and closest to residents also seeing how this is going to be able to benefit them to be able to engage with you and spend the time to help you understand their world as well. And then finally, I put this other because it's such a big category too, but there's some other people that you might want to consider in terms of funders, but more importantly, residents and other resident type groups that might be impacted or affected by these projects that you're undertaking as well. But getting into the priority side, this is something that will help you focus more on what matters to your community and steer clear of these things that might be interesting to you or to a department or something like that, but not necessarily impactful more broadly. So it's really helpful to look at some of the strategic documents if your organization or city has produced some of this. But there's other places too, especially if you have a robust performance program where there's indicators and metrics that you can look at. Any sort of public communications and what the city is currently talking about and what that message is. But also public events. So like in New Orleans, this fire really brought that issue to the surface in the forefront of the city's mind. And so they were able to use this to guide some of their resources and spend analytical time unpacking this problem. And then once you're starting to think more about what good data science projects might be, just kind of keeping this in the top of your mind. When we're talking about a good data science opportunity, we're looking at things that are going to make an outcome in your community, not necessarily like a technical outcome. So sometimes I see some project proposals that are more focused on creating a data warehouse or setting up standards across data sets and departments. And while all of that is important and can help analysis in the future, it's not necessarily going to be what your data science team is going to be spending most of their time on or not how they can be most effectively used. So also looking at doing service changes and more tangible sort of problems and projects that you can sink your teeth into rather than more research or exploratory analysis. Again, there's some advanced analytical techniques to help you identify what is going on, what's the trend, and trying to even predict into the future. But trying to undertake what we would call a data science project is a little bit more focused on how can we optimize best these service industries, service changes, service issues that we're seeing within existing programs that maybe already be surfaced through performance issues and things like that. We're also looking at small changes. We're all here because we want to help our communities, but going into this by saying, I want to do a data science project to solve poverty is not going to go very far. So being able to break that kind of an issue down to smaller sort of projects and smaller changes that you can tackle within maybe a 6-month project is going to help tackle that larger issue over time and be able to have more success in setting up your data science projects as well. And then also that it's using existing data, and so you're relying on the inventories and catalogs that you already have, the data that's available, and you're not talking about new streams of data collection, you're not talking about a totally new system or anything like that. Being able to work within what you already have is really powerful, and being able to reduce the resource impact that you're making on the rest of the city will help get to a better outcome in the end as well. So this is generally the process that I take. I borrowed a lot of this from IDEO's human design principles. And basically this line is a convergence of ideas. So you're generating more ideas during brainstorming, then refining, you're eliminating some of those ideas, but you're generating some new ones as well. And then finally, when you get to the end and you're starting to go into this planning phase, you arrive at this one final project with an implementation strategy going forward. So step one is going to be this brainstorming phase where we're trying to really identify our opportunity. And the goal here is to come up with a list of service issues that could present good project opportunities. So I'm trying to take a little bit of a slower sort of on-ramp to starting the scoping process. Some people here might already be at the point where they know what sort of service issue or problem they're facing, and you might be able to skip forward a couple of steps. But if you're just starting out, it's really helpful starting from the strategic priorities and then going through and trying to identify those service issues where you can really make an impact. And this is like the sort of the hierarchy that I'm describing here, where we started off earlier on looking at strategic documents, looking at communications, things like that to try to identify what the city is focused on and what our priorities are. So once we have that in mind, we can start looking at what sort of activities do we do to support that priority. And then even going down a little bit farther, what are the issues that are currently associated with that activity? And from there, we can start generating some actual project ideas that we can explore a little bit farther along. So kind of taking this down the road of healthy neighborhoods, we might then say two things that we do as a city to support this goal of healthy neighborhoods are blight reduction and community policing. And some things that I might have seen through some performance measures or something like that could be that, blight reduction, there's a lot of long inspection times. People aren't getting out to these buildings promptly to actually enter them into the system. And then there's a backlog of blight cases. Similar, New Orleans had this issue where they knew where all of this blight was, but it was taking a while to get them into mitigation programs. And then, other sorts of things around community policing, like non-local applicants or other things that they might have surfaced already as main concerns for them in these programs. So we're going to pause here for a second and shake things up, get me not talking as much. And so if you look in the back of your packet, there's a sheet that's called the activity brainstorming worksheet. I think it's activity C. And on this page, you should see this familiar setup from here, where right now we're trying to think of a priority and then getting into the activities and service issues underneath them here. So what I want you all to do right now is just to think on your own for a little bit about what a high priority would be in your community. It doesn't matter if you work for a city or if you just live in a city. What is something that's on the top of your mind? From there, think about what kinds of activities your city does to support those things. So if clean neighborhoods was something that's important, maybe trash pickups or something like that. But think about what sort of things does the city offer that try to drive at that goal. And then for each of those activities, try to come up with at least one potential service issue that they might be facing right now in terms of challenges to operating or to achieving success for them. More packets. Is there any extra packets around the room? On tables nearby? Here's an extra one. Yeah. Yep. Anybody else need a packet? Yeah, we have an extra one too, so. All right, so sorry to cut everybody a little bit short. I know you're in the midst of some really deep and exciting thoughts. But so maybe we could just go around and talk about just what you thought about this exercise and what your thoughts are in terms of applying some of these different types of analyses to these different service issues that you were coming up with earlier. So I guess we could probably start just back here with I know, because I'll go to the other side this time. It's a good idea.
Well, our issue that we looked at was homelessness, and some of the service activity areas was looking at drug treatment, mental health, and providing affordable housing. As far as a possible project, what we looked at as far as those choices there is optimizing resource allocation and really looking at all the resources that are available to address homelessness, whether it's affordable housing resources or resources for treatment for drug addiction or mental health, and really determining which of those services would be most sustainable and most effective.
Yeah, obviously, cities have a lot of different interventions for the types of issues that they're facing, and different interventions are going to be most impactful for different people. And I think that this is one of the power, one of the big insights of data science is being able to get down to a more granular level, so that now you're not just choosing the best program that works overall, but maybe the best program that works for this individual as well. And so being able to say, matching these resources to these individuals is it doesn't sound like it's a big, sexy data science project, but it's really hugely impactful for the individuals that go through this. There was actually a project with the government in Mexico where they were trying to actually proactively identify people who are not taking advantage of social services that they were eligible for. And I know this is something that New York City has been interested in doing as well, is more proactively finding people that are eligible but not taking advantage of some of these programs to help folks in their situation. And so being more proactive about reaching out can help to actually connect these people with services, even if they might be a little bit distrustful of government or might not think to proactively go out and reach out for help in that way as well. Does anybody else from this back table have anything to add before I go to other folks? Does anybody from this front table have anything? I know you had some complicated issues to work through, so maybe.
Sure. I mean, I can share thoughts. I'm not sure that my problems are. I feel like the data analysis, that my problems are bigger than one problem, and the data analysis might come when I get them down to smaller problems. But I was looking at affordable housing, which I can see is a common issue in the room. And our primary issues are funding, of course, that we don't have a lot of municipal authority to actually mandate any institutions to provide affordable housing, and then the fact that we can't really get for-profit developers to contribute voluntarily, and since we can't mandate them, we're sort of in trouble there. So my projects were like thinking about outside funding, like philanthropy options. We are a Bloomberg What Works city. We're using some of that funding. They're not looking at affordable housing right now, but they're looking at some other crucial issues like reentry. And once that project is done, we might be able to repurpose that team to think more about how do we get outside money. For the lack of municipal authority, honestly, the only solution is to get rid of about 70% of our state House and Senate, which could be a really cool data analysis project. Right, I'm sure there are. Just like, which districts are flippable and how you target the people in those districts. But yeah, 70% minimum of those people have to go. And then for the for-profit developers not really being willing to contribute, my idea was I continue to think about basically taking housing out of the market. So having permanent affordable housing that is controlled by nonprofit, mission-driven institutions rather than for-profit developers, and getting a certain percentage of the housing in the city into like a land trust or habitat like stocks or organizations that provide like transitional housing, so that there isn't as much, so that the capacity for people to speculate on land goes down, and therefore the overall gentrification problem is mitigated. But I don't know how to, none of those really lend themselves to an easy like, let's do this data analysis thing,
Yeah, I think that that's definitely a very challenging issue, and money and resources obviously are always tight. Like no matter where you're going there. So, but I think you hit on a couple of different things here. One of which is that not every problem is a good data science problem, and that's okay. This part of the brainstorming process here is to try to identify all of these needs, then trying to select the best one from within it as well. That doesn't mean that these aren't other things here aren't needs or aren't priorities or something like that, but there's probably just better solutions or better interventions that we can use to try to make progress on that. In terms of elections and things like that, I won't get into too much of that, but I think that there's always carrots and sticks to try to incentivize different actions, and Portland, Oregon is a city that's facing a lot of gentrification and affordability issues. So I know that in a non-data science capacity, the mayor was really interested in trying to find out, how could they support more affordable housing development? Is it through lowering the fees that developers pay? Is it by trying to increase the staffing within permitting offices to make the process go faster? What are the pain points that developers are feeling that are driving them away from this process? And really when they started digging into the data, they found that it's not the fees. The fees were a pretty small part of a construction project, but a big part of the city's permitting office budget. And so they started looking at other sorts of solutions in terms of how can we offer incentives, non-financial incentives, to try to encourage this sort of development in areas that we want it. And I think that they're still trying to figure out that nut, but they've started having these more data-oriented conversations around how they can actually achieve these goals. So we're running a little bit short on time, and I know that everybody's really dying to get to the closing session here, so we'll pick back up here. But feel free to come up to me later and continue these conversations. So generally, when we're going through this refining step, we really want to try to get as succinct as possible so that when we're talking to folks, we can describe our project. And so often when we're talking about refining and getting to an outcome, it could be helpful to try to think about this in terms of getting to this one sentence where, we will blank to blank in order to blank by blank. So filling this in, it might be saying, we will create recommendation tools to match blighted properties with mitigation strategies in order to improve neighborhood health by removing unsafe buildings. And so this matches together the priorities, together with the actual actions that they're doing, the analysis that they're going to be doing to support that, and what their overall outcome is going to be in the end. And so finally, step 3 here is going to be actually making this plan. So once you have your problem step in mind, it's been refined, it's very specific, we want to get down now into an actual actionable plan that will incorporate all of these various perspectives. So thinking about this in sort of a visual manner, we start off with this brainstorming session where we're coming up with lots of ideas. We put it through a refining filter, and at the end, we'll probably come up with a couple of different project ideas that we can pursue. So these are not necessarily, we have to do only one or only two. We can kind of pick and choose from among these to do now or later. But once you have that project idea, the next step is to really get into the planning part. So starting off with scoping, do you have the data access that you need and the stakeholder buy-in? Starting to schedule meetings 2 to 3 months out, so that way you have deadlines to meet, and also you're making sure that you're communicating progress back to stakeholders inside of departments. And then making sure that this is going to be feasible to actually implement and carry out within the time period that you're talking about. Once you have all of that together, the next step is going to be doing the data wrangling, and so starting to think through where are you going to be looking for data to collect. Is this going to be departmental data? Are you going to look at the census or weather information? Are there nonprofits that are generating data that you want to collect and merge together? And then thinking through, what is that going to take in order to organize everything and clean it? What kind of tools and infrastructure are you going to need to support that? And what kind of people are you going to need to involve? Then getting into the exploration, where we're leaning more on the analytical skills here of trying to figure out, what is the story? What are the trends that are going on here? And trying to start developing what are called toy models, where you're trying to think, what are the sort of levers that are going on here that are really driving the different issues that we're seeing? So in Kansas City, we saw that there were, the main problem was this workload that was increasing, where people weren't closing out open violations, and the amount of time to resolution was going on and on and on. So we hypothesized that this was being driven by inefficient re-inspections, and so that rather than closing out open violations, they were actually opening new ones. And so we wanted to test that out into the data and be able to validate it before making our final analytical product. But this is sort of a way of saying this is what we think the action is and how it works, and now we have this hypothesis that we can go and test it out in what we see actually happening in our community. Then we get into this analysis step. So who's going to be doing what kind of analysis? Matching this back to the project types earlier. Who do we need to pull into this, and who do we need to involve in order to get to this result? And then once we're there, how do we make sure that this is a valid result and that this is predicting what we think it's predicting? Looking at outcomes in the community, what sorts of things are you going to test to guard against bias or things like that, and starting to plan out what you might be needing at that point. And it's important, this is all just a plan, and so it's fine to say that you don't know the answers to this right now, but this is obviously answers that need to be put into this plan at some point. So good to know where your blind spots are, but being able to fill in as much as you can. And then the final step is obviously going to be thinking through implementation. And this is where a lot of data science projects fall flat, because they've done all of this work, but now they need somebody to actually trust in it and use it on a day-to-day basis, spend money on an infrastructure to support it, and hand over control to some extent to it as well. So when you're thinking about how are you going to implement this, it's important to think through, you're going to have a pilot phase where you're testing this out in the community, you're seeing how this operates, and how you're going to strategize getting this done. What does the infrastructure look like technologically, but also to support the folks that are out there working with residents? If there's anything else that needs to be provisioned, being able to put in requests earlier. And then also looking at what are your measures of success and how do you incorporate feedback? If an inspector is saying this isn't working, or a police manager says that this isn't coming up with good recommendations, how can you incorporate that back in and make sure that you're still meeting the needs of everybody involved as well? So communication throughout this process is really going to be key, both with the external partners that you're involving that are going to be impacted by this, but also internally as well. We recommend having these 30-minute in-person meetings. So we did this over the phone with some of our partners as well, just on a weekly basis in order to touch base on what's happening, what the needs are, if there's any barriers or anything like that. But also sharing progress, and we talked about these sort of interstitial presentations and being able to say to the broader community, the department, not just your little project team, here's what we're working on and here's what we're finding. And that way everybody can also validate your understanding of the data as you're going along and making sure that you can understand the trends and outliers and things like that as well. two last thoughts on this. Schedule far in advance. It gives you a deadline and a motivation to complete things by, but it also makes sure that you have all the right people in the room when you need to have discussions and have their eyes on this and their full attention as well. And make sure that you're matching the presentation material to the audience as well. So if you're talking to more junior analysts, making sure that they can talk to folks that are going to get more into the weeds than somebody who's maybe a manager or decision maker that needs to have a higher level picture about how this is going to impact their work and the operations as they currently are. So just to kind of leave you with this thought, when you talk to data scientists, most of the time what they'll talk to you about is data cleaning and organizing. My favorite alternative title for a data scientist is a data janitor. And so going through some of these scoping steps can really help you to anticipate some of the delays that are happening here, organize the data ahead of time, and really reduce the amount of time that the overall project takes. If you are leaving out some of these steps and things like that, you run the risk of having your project get derailed by other topics to explore, changes midstream in terms of what the implementation might look like, or even if somebody gets uncomfortable with the things that you're doing and maybe they're not bought in all the way, all of these things can really jeopardize a successful conclusion. So just with that, just to recap really quickly and then going into questions, brainstorming, refining, and planning, making sure that you're coming up with lots of ideas before narrowing down to ones that you want to really focus in on and develop out farther. And then being able to start out from your community priority and then working down from there in order to make sure that your project stays focused on really meaningful and impactful projects as well. Make sure that you're both talking to people in the community inside and outside the city so that you're going to come up with a result and an outcome that's most useful and impactful and people want to use. But then also think that you were going to be planning this out. This is hopefully the first step. As you see at the back of the packet, there's also one last worksheet to help think through whatever sort of project ideas you came up with during this brainstorming exercise as well. So thank you all for your time today. I'll open this up for any general questions. I think that we're maybe a couple of minutes behind, but I'll be here afterwards if you wanted to come and ask anything else. But otherwise, thanks so much for your time today.